Star Wars The Grey War, Chapter 5 by Nathan Brown.
Rogan sat in the pit for a few minutes, ignoring the crowd, waiting in silence. The platform that had lowered the Wookiee dropped down now, carrying a man and a large, white beast at least 2.5 meters tall, covered in chains. The man ushered the beast off the platform and dragged the Wookiee's body and weapon onto the platform. He produced a large key and unlocked the chains entangling the monster, then rushed back onto the platform. The towering white creature growled and lifted his ARMS, shrugging the chains off so they fell in a clump at his feet. Rogan stood up, holding his sword low and bouncing on the balls of his feet, trying to warm his muscles back up. The icy beast looked so out of place among the reddish-orange planet and its supremely warm climate. The Wampa let loose a terrible roar and charged with his arms outstretched. The white giant had charged so quickly, without analyzing his opponent for even a second, that Rogan wasn't ready for it. He backed up quickly, trying to figure out his plan, until he felt the spikes at his back. The Wampa closed in on him, moving faster than he would have thought possible for such a large animal. Rogan dove to the left quickly, dropping his sword in the process. He realized he was rolling too fast and tried to stop himself, but still hit the spikes protruding from the wall. His thick armor protected him and he turned to see the beast running towards him yet again. This time, Rogan dove forward, rushing past the lumber-bearing Wampa and picking up his sword. He got to one knee and turned to face the shaggy white beast. He swung towards the Wampa, still facing away from him, and the tip of his new sword sliced into the back of the Wampa's legs. The beast howled and turned, swinging his fist down to crush Rogan. Still on one knee, Rogan pushed off with his free hand and rolled backwards out of the way, just as the fist slammed into the ground. Rogan stood up and moved to the middle of the ring away from this big ass. Now that the behemoth was weakened, and Rogan was prepared for it, he thought maybe he could stand up to it. With yet another growl, it started moving slowly towards him, its legs shaking beneath it. As it got in range, it swiped at Rogan, lifting its arm high to crush him into the ground. Rogan raised his sword over his head to block. The thick arm connected with the sword, the fine edge almost cutting straight through the massive forearm. The beast groaned with pain and swiped sideways with the other arm, catching Rogan in the face and knocking him onto his back. The Wampa retreated back, holding his injured arm close to his chest. Rogan shook his head, trying to brush away the ache in his jaw, and stood up. He ran towards his wounded enemy with his sword raised high. He brought it down, aiming to slice into the Wampa's chest and finish the fight. Before he could, the Wampa reached up with his good hand and slapped the sword away, knocking it from his hands. The Wampa lashed out, trying to take advantage of Rogan's surprise, aiming to backhand Rogan. Rogan ducked under the arm and extended his retractable claws. He shot his arm up into the Wampa's throat, grabbing as much flesh as he could and tearing it out. The beast gurgled and fell to his knees, swaying for a moment before dropping to his face. As soon as his opponent was dead, the adrenaline drained from Rogan's body and he sank to the ground, trying to get the most out of his rest. Before long, he heard the mechanical whizzing of the lowering crane. He lifted his head and a slight man that Rogan recognized from his limited knowledge of other species as a Zabrak. He looked like he was just over 1.5 meters tall and didn't look like he weighed more than 55 kilograms. His skin was a deep red, interlaid with intricate black tattoos. Though the man was small, Rogan could see the ropey muscles beneath the man's thin, loose shirt. He had multiple horns protruding from his skull and small, bright red eyes. In his right hand, he held a lightweight sword with a long, thin blade. In addition to the sword, the Zabrak held a large shield made of some dark gray metal. It was a circular shape and looked to be just over 1 meter in diameter. Rogan stood up slowly and moved to the center of the pit. The Zabrak jumped nimbly off the wooden platform onto the sand, darkened by the blood of his former combatants. Behind him a man dragged the Wampa's dead body onto the platform. Rogan walked to the middle of the pit and held his sword towards the man. The Zabarak reached his sword out and touched the tip of his sword to Rajan's. They stepped back and analyzed each other for a moment. The Zabrak held his shield high, covering a good portion of his body, and extended his sword arm to the side. Rogan let his sword hang to his side and kept his free hand relaxed with the claws extended. A warrior should know the name of the man who kills him. The Zabrak sneered with a mocking grin as they circled each other. I am Sorniel, son of Athniel. Rogan nodded, thinking how wonderful it would feel to punch the man's smiling teeth out. Rogan of Tribe Ender, but I am known on my planet as Blight of Barabel. Sorniel laughed insultingly at the last part. He stopped circling and walked forward, hiding behind his shield, sword arm stretched out to the side, away from his body. Rogan moved forward and swung his arm up and brought it down on the Zabrak, who ducked his head and let the heavy blow bounce off his shield, creating a sharp clanging sound and making Rajan's sword tremor. Sorniel slashed his sword quickly across Rajan's chest, slicing through his tunic and scraping along his scales. He followed it up with a quick backhanded slash to his face. The foil didn't pierce his skin, but it stung and distracted him. Rogan lashed out with his leg, kicking the man's shield, trying to give himself time to regain his focus. The man stumbled back for a moment, but then continued his assault. The tiny needle rapped against Rajan's scales, moving too quickly for Rogan to counter. The strikes did no real damage themselves, but the distractions opened them up for the Zabrak to step forward and swing his shield out, bashing Rajan's face with the solid metal. It felt like he had been run over by a speeder. Bells rang inside his head and Rogan didn't know how he managed to stay standing as he stumbled backwards on trembling legs. Only slightly controlling his movements, he covered his hasty retreat with a broad, two-handed swipe that Sorniel easily sidestepped. Rogan regained his composure and stood up straight, waiting for the man's next attack. The slender, biting sword quickly came from the side towards Rajan's face, but Rogan reached out with his left hand and grabbed it. The skin on his palm was thick, but the blade still cut a shallow groove in his hand. He ignored the pain and snapped the fragile blade in half. The man stared incredulously at his suddenly useless weapon. Opening his hand, Rogan released the broken pieces of metal and before Sorniel could recover, opened his claws and slashed down on the man's wrist, severing tendons and forcing him to release the hilt of the useless sword. The Zabrak screamed in pain, but managed to retain his composure. He stepped forward and swung his shield wide, forcing Rogan to jump backward to avoid it. Sorniel quickly stepped back and brought his shield up, covering almost his entire body with the oversized buckler. There was clear opportunity to swipe at the man's exposed leg, but Rogan felt something. Fear, not in himself, but in the Zabrak. He could feel it, could smell it. It was palpable and pungent. He breathed deep and sucked it in. It flowed through him, strengthening and refueling him and bringing up a desire to prolong the fight. With a mighty heave, he slammed his sword into the man's shield, bearing down with all his strength and tightening the grip on his sword to keep it from shaking. He heard Sorniel grunt from behind his shield as the blow clanged into his protection, forcing the smaller man to take a step back to brace himself. Rogan continued hammering down on the shield, striking from all angles, reveling in the fear gushing from the man, growing with every strike. It filled the air around them and Rogan used it to strike stronger and faster. Scene change. Cognews looked on from the stands as the armored giant rained blows down on the cowering man. Even from here she could feel him feeding off the Zabrak's fear. This fight would be over soon. Scene change. Sorniel was forced to continue retreating and now his back was up against the spikes. Rogan felt as if he could see the fear and panic oozing from the Zabrak. Rogan grabbed onto the pommel of his sword and spun in a circle, swinging in a large arc, letting his sword build momentum and guiding it to the side of the Zabrak's shield. The force of the blow, fueled by momentum and the man's fear, overwhelmed Sorneel's defenses, and his shield was ripped from his grasp and fell to the floor. With no weapons or defenses remaining, the Zabrak, looking significantly less ferocious now, held his hands up in a pathetic show of surrender. Rogan drank in the terror radiating from the man. Instead of simply cutting him down, Rogan jumped into the air and kicked the man in the chest with both feet. Rogan fell onto hard to his back and Sorneel was pushed backwards, impaled on the spikes. Rogan rolled to his stomach and used his sword to help him stand up. He walked towards his fallen foe, still standing straight up, impaled and held up by the long bone spikes. He stared at the Zabrak, an expression of pain and shock permanently fixed on his face. The body was pierced in half a dozen places. Tips of 2 spikes were visible from the front, protruding through the shoulder and stomach of the dead man. As the bloodlust and adrenaline of battle faded away, Rogan felt the beginning of guilt creep up in its place. He'd had to kill the man, but he didn't need to do it in such an unbelievably cruel way. Never before had he reveled in taking another life like that. He basked in the man's fear and tortured him instead of just ending it like he should have. He reached up with his hand and pulled the man's eyelids over his wide eyes. Feeling suddenly tired, he sat down. Only 2 more fights and he would be free. Scene change. Cognews puzzled over the Barabel's latest actions. He had shown such strength in his latest fight, but now this. He showed weakness in his care for his defeated enemies. It was strange that he could savor the fear he conjured in the man one moment and then have compassion for him in the next. Despite this oddity, she held to her faith in the Force. It would not have shown her this man if he wasn't ready to become her apprentice. Scene change. "You will tell no one I was here," Kinza said with a calm, soothing voice, using the Force to push at the human's mind to persuade him. She hated using such methods on innocent civilians. It wasn't the Jedi way. But sometimes sacrifice had to be made for the greater good of the galaxy, and, besides, it's not like one could actually call this dirty, soiled slaver an innocent. "I will tell no one you were here," the man echoed back to her with an empty voice, his blank eyes seeming to stare past Kinza. Kinza turned away from the slaver, feeling both satisfied and angry. She finally knew, after talking to dozens of these lowlifes, that Rogan was on Algaro fighting for his freedom in the gladiator pits. Even though she had the information, she couldn't do anything about it. Algaro was days away and she was already way behind. By the time she got there, the fights would be over. For all she knew, Rogan could have already left the planet. There was a chance he was defeated in the ring, but she knew she couldn't count on that. Based on their brief encounter, it was plausible he would be successful. She ran back to her ship to set a course for Algaro. She had to at least try to catch him. Kinza had let him slip through her fingers. She was responsible for him now. Scene change. After what felt like only a few seconds, Rogan looked up to see a middle-aged Barabel being lowered into the pit. He brandished a sword similar to Rajan's, and his gray scales showed him to be a Hoskar. Rogan breathed a sigh of relief at this. He'd been worried that he would end up fighting another Ender. The man was smaller than Rogan, both in height and weight, but he was still large for a member of the smaller tribe. The man walked slowly to the middle of the ring. "I'm sorry we must fight, my cousin, but my family needs me," said the man, bowing low. "I'm sorry to deprive your family of one of their providers. I hope their other father can support them," replied Rogan, bowing back. "So certain you will win, young one." The man chuckled, shaking his head with a slight smile. He took his sword and stabbed it in the ground. "Shall we fight as true warriors?" he asked, holding his hands open. "Fine by me," Rogan replied. planting his sword into the sand as well. Both barbells crouched and extended their hands. Rogan opened the claws on his left hand but kept his right hand's claws retracted. The older man stuck first. Rushing forward at Rogan without much speed, he moved to grab at his legs and drive him to the ground. Before the gray-skinned man could reach him, Rogan went down into a sprawl. The other man launched up suddenly into a headlock, momentum driving his forearm into Rajan's throat, cutting off his air. Rogan slammed his palms into the man's ribs, knocking the wind out of him and feeling the man's grip loosen. Hitting the older man's elbow and pulling his own head down at the same time, he managed to slip out of the man's grasp, then stepped away. He wrapped his ARMS around his opponent and squeezed him as hard as he could, keeping the old man from regaining his breath. He bent his knees and attempted to lift the lighter man. Before he got him off the ground, the housecarl brought his hands down, smashing Rajan's ears, disorientating him and causing him to release the man. Rogan stepped back and kicked quickly at the gray man's knee, crumpling his leg and causing him to fall to a kneeling position. Before his adversary could rise, Rogan brought his knee up into the man's face, knocking him onto his back. Reaching down with his clawed hand, he tried to grab the man, but he slid quickly along the floor and kicked Rajan's legs out from under him. Rogan cursed himself as his head thudded painfully to the floor. He had been so close to finishing it. They both scrambled to their feet and faced each other once again, the other man favoring his right leg and Rogan ignoring his throbbing head. The man lunged forward, grabbing at Rajan's chest, but his leg caused him to stumble and he only managed to grab onto his shirt. Rogan jumped backwards and his shirt, already cut from the Zabrak's many slices, tore off, exposing his chest. The man looked at him with furious, wide eyes. "You!" he exclaimed, diving forward, the man's anger flying towards Rogan along with his body. He tackled Rogan to the ground and straddled him, hammering down with his clenched fists and roaring with rage. The furious man stopped his desperate assault, reaching up and grabbing hold of one of the spikes. He snapped it off and brought it down towards Rajan's face. Finally recovering from the unexpected and overwhelming barrage, Rogan grabbed the man's wrist, working to keep the sharp bone away from his face. Bit by bit, it moved down, pushed on by overwhelming anger. Looking past the curved spike, Rogan could see the grimacing, hateful look of the man who wanted nothing more than to kill him. He felt the man's pulsing rage washing over him, rejuvenating his tired muscles. With his new strength, he wrenched the man's wrist to the side, hearing the pop as it snapped, followed by the splintered bone breaking through the gray scales. The spike fell harmlessly to the ground and the man screamed in pain. The rage that had been pouring forth disappeared in a flash, replaced by blinding agony. Rogan pinned the man's legs beneath him and rolled to the right, getting on top of the still screaming man. He grabbed the spike where it lay and, without hesitation, jabbed it from the side into the man's skull. The sharpened bone easily pierced the man's relatively soft temple and drove into his brain, killing him instantly and putting an end to his howling. The force-fueled energy immediately drained out of Rogan and he collapsed from exhaustion. He lay there atop the dead body for a few moments before he felt two sets of arms lifting him up. Still too exhausted to move, he was half dragged and half walked along the sand to be dropped onto a hard wooden surface. He forced himself to sit up and look around. He realized he was being lifted out of the hole. Sitting slumped, with his head practically in his lap, it seemed like he was being rescued out of a massive crater in the earth or the mouth of some monster with long bone teeth. In his mind, he knew it was only a few meters high, but he felt as if he were being pulled up for hours. Maybe he was hallucinating. With a few deep breaths, he started clearing his head, started coming back to reality. He gathered his strength and was able to pull himself up by the time the platform came to a stop. For the first time in what felt like hours, he became aware of the world outside the pit. He heard the crowd screaming and he stepped uncertainly onto the arena sand. The loud voice was still screaming over the microphone, but he couldn't understand the words. It was just a noisy blur. He felt someone grab his arm and raise it in the air. He turned to see the short, dark-skinned man smiling wider than Rogan had ever seen a human smile. He realized he was being cheered and celebrated, but didn't understand why. He knew he had to win 5 fights and he was certain he had only won 4. Despite his confusion, he couldn't help being happy. As long as he wasn't fighting, he felt good. The larger human came next to him and propped him up as they started walking away from the pit and the dead body it contained. He leaned heavily on the man, practically being dragged back to the bench where he had been sitting before the fights. As soon as he sat down, his legs turned to jelly. He honestly didn't think he could have walked one more step. He felt something being pushed at his lips and he gulped down the cool water. "All right, kid, I'm gonna tell you the truth. No one makes it past 4 fights. You're the first in almost 10 years. We don't tell you all that, 'cause then you all wouldn't fight. But now you're gonna fight our reigning champions for your last fight. There's 2 of them, Cat, are twins. One's huge and the other is a tiny little guy. I convinced my pop to give you 45 minutes rest before you fight 'em. They haven't lost, not once. But I got a feeling about you. You've got my bet." Rogan stared at him, hearing nothing after 45 minutes rest. He ate the dried meats that were shoved at him and drifted off into a light sleep. Scene change. Cognews was certain now why the Force had brought her here. Not that she'd ever had any doubts. She'd been disappointed when he had shown remorse towards the Zabrak, but seeing him draw strength from the other Barbel's anger made up for it. He was destined for the dark side. He was untrained in the Force, and yet he could already transform and control other people's emotions. She was unable to tell exactly how strong he was until she was in his presence, but, based on his performance alone, she knew he was capable. Scene change. Darth Millennial stood over his courtyard, watching his pupils as they trained amongst themselves. He had almost 50 now of various abilities and strengths. He stepped off the ledge and levitated down among them. They stopped their drills and turned to face him. "Kneel," he spoke in a still whisper. His students took a knee, looking up at their master with a mix of fear and admiration. "I have had a vision," he said in a quiet voice, forcing his acolytes to strain to hear. "An alien, a beast, is coming to us soon. He does not come to join us, but to destroy us. I don't know when he will arrive or where he comes from, but he must be stopped. You must train harder to prepare for this challenger. We live together. We all need to train together. We need to fight together, and if we die, we will die together. We will not die though," he corrected himself quickly. "We will conquer the galaxy together. I have seen it. It will come to pass."